Here at T.REX Arms, we think about manufacturing quite a bit because we do manufacturing quite a bit. We just went to a manufacturing show, and that was a T.REX Labs video a couple days ago. I have the perfect guest to talk about manufacturing in the United States, present and potentially future. Welcome back to another T.REX Talk. My guest today is our engineer, Pete. You've been in a couple of Labs videos, Pete, and some people have deduced from your accent that you may not be from Tennessee.
I'm not from Tennessee.
Now, some people point out you didn't have a Southern accent, but they're wrong. You have almost the most Southern accent that is possible.
Much further, and you end up in the snow.
Yes. Yeah. It's a fascinating story of how we know each other, but let's not talk about that quietly. Let's get to that a little bit later. Manufacturing in America. I have been doing this for a pretty short amount of time. You have been in manufacturing for a very long time. You've been doing manufacturing in America for a pretty short time too. But we were both at the Design to Part show. What were some of the things that you, what were your main initial takeaways, gut feelings at the show?
My first observations was it was a more regional.
Yes, that's a good point.
Event. The last one we went to was in Atlanta, so
a lot more folks.
I believe that's a bigger event. So
yeah.
And this time I noticed a lot more printed circuit board vendors, maybe because I was looking for T.REX related work. Maybe it was a little bit subjective, but I noticed an increase, and I don't know if that's a correct observation or not, but yeah.
Yeah. So you are from Australia, and in Australia, obviously it's the land of Mad Max. It's the land of making anything with number 8 wire, figuring stuff out yourself. You come from a place where children learn to weld before they learn how to walk. So yes. Fabrication and making things is very much in your blood. And now that you've been in America for a while, and I guess it's a little unfair because you work in a manufacturing shop that values this kind of thing, but how do the two cultures compare in this kind of problem solving and making stuff area?
It's been a very interesting journey, actually, to see. And I haven't seen enough of America yet. I was 45 years in Australia.
It's true that there's quite a bit of Australia.
Yeah, I don't think I have a balanced perspective yet. But Australia being very much an agriculture and mining-based country, and a lot of the country is regional. I might touch on this later in the podcast. I don't know. That influences people's habits and skill sets and institutions, training, prerogatives and programs and things. So I see a much more decentralized vocational interests.
Interesting, yeah. Is there the same in the States? I have a feeling that we have leaned a little too heavily on credentialism. So your expertise comes from your credentials more than your experience. Not in every field,
right?
But in a lot of fields. Mm-hmm. Is that happened in Australia to the same extent, or?
Well, I think a lot of this conversation I should try and keep very relative rather than absolute, because the dynamics of two.
And Australia is quite large as well.
Yes, it has a lot of advanced industry. Because I've moved to a regional area in America, it feels like I've moved from an advanced country to a less advanced country, which is probably not fair to say that, because
Tennessee
it depends where you go in any given country.
Middle Tennessee is not what I would call an advanced country, but it is the country.
Right.
It's pretty rural.
So I need to see more of America. So I'll make relative statements.
Yeah.
I think the difference between the American culture and the Australian culture is influenced by the agricultural mining sectors a fair bit.
Those are potentially like high dollar. Those are things that you can do in your backyard, or things that can be giant corporate monoliths, like huge, that can be huge industry.
Right.
So in Australia, do you have both? Do you still have backyard opal mining and giant corporatized stuff? Because in America, we have lost a lot of our small farms, and our agriculture has become pretty industrialized and pretty corporatized. So that's a bit of a thing that we have lost, is the rural, small, decentralized, personalized half of that.
Right. Yes, that is very apparent. Particularly from the area we were at, agriculture was very strong, and it was very diverse as well. Where we've come to now, agriculture is very much a grandfathered opportunity, and it's not as much a part of the state's GDP. Given, the secondary industry and manufacturing things here is something else. We've got some really big multinational companies operating within an hour's drive.
Right. Yeah. Major medical operations. Yeah. All kinds of things. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
So, yeah, it is interesting how that has kind of happened. And some of that has happened not in my lifetime, but a lot of that has happened in my dad's lifetime. And all of it basically happened in my grandfather's lifetime. This changeover in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s to pretty industrialized farming and more centralized stuff in that space. Yeah.
Right.
But in Australia, is there still hobby farming that makes money? Are there still small farms that produce actual food?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was something that I enjoyed about New Zealand, was the fact that was still in full swing, hadn't had the industrialized farming. Some of that was the size of the country, but some of that was government policy, the fact that there weren't farming subsidies anymore, and they relaxed a bunch of the restrictions that used to exist when they had farming subsidies, just leveled the playing field, opened up all kinds of opportunities for innovation. So yeah, that was one of the things coming back to America that I noticed is like, oh, we farm in a very different way than New Zealand does, but also in a very different way than America used to.
Right. I think things are changing in Australia with, there's a lot more corporate involvement where the push to scale is happening more. The expectations of government departments to pre-plan your crops and things like that, to make statements as to what crop you're going to grow where in 3 years' time or 4 years' time, which is very hard to do when you consider weather and market issues. And so that does make it harder for small companies and small farming businesses to manage.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, technically, we're trying to talk about manufacturing, but in some ways, I think manufacturing, you can think about manufacturing on its own, or you can think about manufacturing as something that supports all the other industries. So it absolutely ties into how you farm. Like, there are no small tractor companies anymore because there are no small farms anymore. So manufacturing will be driven by all the other market forces. But you pointed out a obvious, I'll restate that bit. You pointed out a missing link that we have in America that we haven't really noticed that we've lost, or I hadn't certainly thought about. But we went to this Design to Part show, which is a professional trade show, and there were a lot of professional type stuff, large professional service companies and people selling very expensive tools, several $100,000 3D printers, et cetera. And there is a connection all the way down to the hobbyist level. There are hobbyists watching YouTube channels and buying cheap 3D printers and making stuff, and they're interested in relatively advanced tools for things. And they have a rough understanding of like what Elon Musk is doing with gigantic space exploration stuff, and it's getting them excited about industry and about manufacturing technology. But there is kind of a space in the middle where I feel like a lot of us hobbyists folks are kind of at a disadvantage. And I hadn't really thought about that until you pointed out a difference in Australia. The prevalence of tool shops that are halfway in between Lowe's and like massive industrial supply operations. And we're short on those here and have been for some time.
Yes. A case and example, after the trade show, my wife and I wanted to go and get a hog ring stapler.
As you do.
As you do, because we've got some netting to put together for one of my daughter's little enterprises. And I just thought, well, we're in Nashville, we'll pop round and grab one. And only to find out that, well, we had difficulty trying to find a store that would sell something that was sort of outside of the DIY kind of thing that you'd find at Lowe's.
Yeah, Lowe's doesn't have them.
Right. Now, there is why I made the observation, because in the little town of where I came from, Ballarat in Victoria, there was probably 4 major tool shops that would supply anything from like underground cable shears, like a Milwaukee model, power tools.
The stuff that, Milwaukee and DeWalt, so these folks make, but that's bigger and heavier and more commercial than the stuff that you find at Lowe's or Home Depot.
Right, yeah. And say like a roll, a cordless roll former.
The giant heavy duty shears and cutters and crimpers and punchers. Yeah.
So when we found we couldn't get one, we opted to go online and get one.
And of course you can find them online.
Yes, easy enough to do. But it does make me wonder why it's gone online and why it's not local. Is there less demand locally for it? Is that why it's not available here and now? Or is it because the online market and logistics has become so efficient?
Right, yeah. I think that it's a combination of the two things. There definitely has been a optimization for maximum efficiency and profits, which has pushed a lot of stuff online, has gotten rid of lots of little mom and pop shops. But at the same time, that makes it hard for a hobbyist like myself who doesn't know that these tools exist, go to Lowe's, don't see the tools. It would be hard to problem solve in a lot of our local shops, because you would see the same cordless drill that you have at home, the same hammer that you have at home, the same saw that you have at home. You would see new stuff.
Kids took them away.
Yeah. The cordless drill that I used to have at home, etc.
Now.
The hammer that is somewhere. Like I said, I've been doing manufacturing for a real short amount of time. So when I discovered this catalog, the McMaster car catalog, the official serving industry since 1901 catalog of all the things that you could buy, this was great because I didn't grow up around this stuff. And so having a catalog that I could go through and find things that I'd never heard of before, see them categorized in places that I didn't even know were categories, go online and download the CAD files of them so I could build around them. This was huge for me. And I think McMaster does a great job of getting as close as you can to that physical hands-on experience of exploring a tool store and looking for problem-solving stuff as you can get online and in a catalog. But if you're a do-it-yourselfer and you haven't been to school and you haven't worked for somebody that has all of these different things, different linear bearings and the different ways that they're used, you don't know what to ask for. You don't know what to Google. So a thing like McMaster helps, but some of those tool shops, I do really miss those. I have vague, dim memories of that kind of thing when I was young. And I do miss having more hands-on experience with some of that stuff, being able to pick something up and have Dad explain what it was, that kind of thing.
Right, yes. And when those stores are present, there's often, because there's demand, which means you're likely to live in a community that is using them. And if they're using them, if your next door neighbour is using them, it's very likely that you'll look over the fence and say, hey, what you got there? And you'll be exposed to that method or that option because it's around you.
Yeah. How long do you think those tool shops will stay open in Australia?
Very interesting. Very interesting. I think because Australia, another dynamic with Australia is basically you've got two really big hubs. You've got Melbourne and Sydney.
Yep.
To some extent, Brisbane and Adelaide, but
massive
two
population
very
centers.
prominent capital cities.
Yeah.
And then the regional areas are a lot more regional than what you'd call regional here.
Yeah, like we're in the middle of nowhere, but an hour from Nashville and an international airport and multinational corporations and giant medical hubs. And yeah.
Right. Yep.
But Nashville is still a tiny city by American standards in many ways.
Yes. So I think the logistics in Australia will be interesting because you've got 20,000 people as opposed to, 25 million people in Australia, as opposed to like 350 million or something.
Depends on how many folks you count, but yeah, at least, yeah.
That's another whole topic. Yeah. So
yeah, would you like to weigh in on immigration as a major policy? It's probably not wise for you to do at the moment, but
I'm sure there are other YouTubers can cover that for us.
Yeah.
So you've got a tenth of the population in roughly the same area of landmass. So then you've got two major hubs that are dominant. So how does that work with online marketing and logistics? Because online is also logistics. You can't have online commerce without strong logistics. It has to get to you somehow.
Right.
And I don't know if the Australian logistics is as advanced or whether the delivery routes are as viable.
Well, and there's another interesting one, which is if you want to switch over to just buy stuff from China, Australia's closer to China. You should be able to get stuff from China faster. So at some point, we're no longer talking about Australian logistics. We're talking about global logistics. And we might buy a cheap laser cutter off of Alibaba here in America. That's also the place where you could go and get that in Australia and potentially in less time. So it is interesting to see the way that some of these things develop. And in some ways, I think that the cultural aspect is going to be a bigger one than logistics are very important. Right. Amateurs talk tactics and strategy. Professionals talk logistics. But culture matters a lot. If people are not interested in buying commercial grade equipment to solve problems with, to build stuff with, it doesn't matter where it's available from. They just won't get it. And I see that happening in certain communities in the States. I see that happening in certain communities in New Zealand. New Zealand used to have a amazing do-it-yourself, build anything, fix anything, fabricate anything, invent anything mentality. And it wasn't that long ago that started to kind of disappear. And people got nanny-stated into having solutions spoon-fed to them. That's a fascinating cultural shift to happen. And the dependency is the opposite of what the historical New Zealand position has been. Being the most remote colony in the entire world drove a lot of self-reliance and a lot of inventiveness. And now it's one of the more dependent societies. And it's fine for now because the global supply chains are running, and surely they always will. And the things that are being mandated or handed down or planned for them by the government are benevolent, and surely always will be. So it's okay if people can't solve problems on their own anymore. We'll leave that comment right there.
I think it's interesting too, the life cycle of national cultures too, perhaps, because say America is 400 years, give or take, old. Australia and New Zealand are sort of 200 years old, give or take. So our infrastructure and communities and things happened much later.
Yes.
So capital cities were colonies when America's big industry and big metropolises were already in existence. And so our regional areas were really crazy outposts.
Yes, I've seen Mad Max, which I understand is a documentary, and
Well, I wouldn't take that as typical, but
right, yeah.
just for the record.
It was actually filmed in your neck of the woods, so you're the expert on this.
We actually owned the building that Mad Max was.
The official garage.
The official garage was
Your actual shop. Yeah.
Yes, it was. It was a much loved little piece of history.
Yeah. Small world. Yeah.
It is. But with that timeline in mind, 50 years ago, or a couple of generations ago, people were living in very, I'm going to say primitive situations, but in less developed regional areas.
You had schools of the air. You had all kinds of very interesting things
all gravel roads.
People being spread out. Yeah.
Your Ma and Pa shop doubled as a, what do you call it over here, takeout? Or
it could be a restaurant and a general store.
And a general store and a hardware store and a dealership.
Yep.
To have all those in one business was more common in regional Australia 2 generations ago.
Yeah.
So when you have situations like during the war, I don't think we've mentioned this in any other podcast or anything, but I've heard stories from relatives and friends that when the Australian and Americans were working side by side in the field, there was a lot of initiative and can-do and repair tendencies, and to some extent even more tolerance for adverse circumstances in any given situation, because in Australia during that time, their home front, their home and hearth was probably quite underdeveloped, you say, or
right. You were still a very, very young country supporting the powers of the world in a world war. It's kind of an interesting situation to be in. Yeah.
I think of you hear the story of the rats of Tobruk basically living under rocks in the tremendous African heat, in quite difficult circumstances, to say the least. A lot of those Anzacs were probably a few months prior to that hand digging fence post holes for mile after mile,
right,
in similar kind of heat, and just very grateful to have a canvas self-evaporating water bag hanging on the front of the Range Rover.
Yeah. Wartime conditions were not that different.
Right.
Yeah.
As Australia has developed, those experiences are less remembered. So
the lessons get forgotten too.
Will Australia be in the same place that America is in another 50 years' time? And where did America get, or when did the very integrated supply chains and sort of consumerism sort of really happen in America? Why did it happen? Why is the pace of which something is produced, used, and discarded so quick?
Yeah. How did it get so short? And then the interesting thing is, regardless of how old you are as a company, or as a country, sorry, it doesn't matter whether you're a brand new country like Australia or New Zealand, or a very old country like England, you get the internet at almost the same time. Few years different. You get global supply chains and container ships traversing the globe and just-in-time shipping almost at the same time, give or take a few years. So the maturity of the country no longer applies. It's kind of like with kids. Like I have my oldest son had to wait a long time before he was allowed to do certain things, but now that he's allowed to do them, the other kids kind of are doing them too. And that is how the world has developed a bit. So yeah, that's an interesting dynamic.
I think there's a whole phase in Australian consumer process where the quality is I believe the quality is expected to be higher. I think the prices are often higher, and then the lifespan, maintenance and is more prized. You expect something that you buy to last. You intend to make it last. You take actions to do that, and then when it gets to make a midlife point in that items, say it's a machine, you rebuild the machine, refurbish it, get another 10 years out of it, and then you wouldn't even scrap it. You would take it to a second-hand dealer, who then might use it as it gets scrapped, I suppose, but as a parts,
as a parts for people that already are using a similar machine. Yeah,
right, and it gets ratted.
It gets more lifespan. It gets more use. Yeah.
Yes, and
than
so
a replaceable, disposable overseas machine. Yeah.
right.
Now we have that over here in the States. We have, I would say, two categories of made in America stuff. We have made in America stuff that is higher quality, more durable, lasts longer, better designed, better QC process, just quality across the board is improved. But we also have made in America stuff that is in some ways, sometimes actually inferior to the mass-produced Chinese stuff, and you buy it because supporting America is the right, moral, patriotic thing to do, and you're helping some small shop that actually isn't very good at what they do. Do you have both of those buckets in Australia? Is there enough patriotism, enough pride to support the little not-so-good shop that's making things locally?
To a lesser extent, I think.
Okay, because that was almost non-existent in New Zealand.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see that. That real strong conscious decision to buy Australian made. I wish I could say that it was, but it's a case of what do we need and what is it going to cost us? Once we've got it, how can we make it last as long as we can?
Yeah.
Also, a question of do we actually really need this, I think is stronger.
Right.
Whereas I feel in America, it might be just my perspective.
If it's available, we buy it.
Yeah. And then we use it as hard as we can, as fast as we can until it's ended its lifespan. And we don't necessarily try and make that lifespan go further or get repurposed.
Right. Well, it's been a couple of years. A better new one is already available.
That's
so
right.
why would we keep using the old one?
Yes. One of my favourite things to do was to, interact with a lot of the local farming enterprises and the farmers, and that they've pulled useful components off all sorts of unrelated machinery and merged them into really functional
Mad Max vehicles. Yeah.
Yes. Well, agricultural machinery.
Agricultural machinery. Yes. Yeah. Well, we've talked pretty widely and broadly about national trends over centuries and stuff. Let's get a little bit more specific. You got a bunch of kids. I've got a bunch of kids. We want our children, I think it's big for both of us, to grow up with a strong work ethic, a lot of creativity, some level of entrepreneurial spirit, and the ability to make stuff. How do you teach that? Because you have a head start. You have some older children than I do, so you've been doing this for longer, and your kids have incredible skills and abilities. If we want to change the trends that we see in the world, and we want the next generation to be better at solving problems, making stuff last, fixing things, building things, adding value, creating wealth, how are you doing that with your kids? What should I be doing with my kids? Like, what are some of the things that we really need to be doing to get the right mindset in place? Because it really is, it is a mindset thing.
I'm glad you mentioned mindset, because the three things that came to mind as you were just speaking was vision, as parents and as industry, mentors or teachers, parents. you really have to have a vision. You can't sort of, I wish my kids would just be more interested in non-screen things, do the same screen things, but in an analog version.
Right. Once again, I will tell everybody at McMaster-Carr, children should be reading this catalog so that they know the stuff that is available to do things in the world.
When it's too much screen time, just do the same thing without screen. But vision is important.
Yeah.
And being involved in doing that is no good sort of saying, I want my children to learn something, because they love praise and they love action. So the first thing to do is to get up earlier than you otherwise would and jump in the car and go and buy that machine, or go and raise that animal, or invent something. And they really can find it a chore if you say, please go and do. But if you say, hey, would you like to come along? Typically they can't get enough of that, you know? And that's very exciting, to be able to go in the direction and encourage really edifying, skill developing activities without any reluctance whatsoever. In fact, endless energy is really exciting. All you have to do is add some vision, some praise, and an invitation.
Yeah. So let's make it real practical. What are some of the things that you're teaching your kids now? Now, it's kind of unfair. Your kids had a head start. Your kids could all weld before they could walk. But like, what are some projects? What are some projects that I should be doing? Because it's very easy. There's all kinds of educational toys. My kids have access to a 3D printer and a whole bunch of stuff that is great, but there is this missing kind of middle space of doing actual work with actual tools that solve actual problems, not just YouTube tutorials and then download a thing from Thingiverse and then print it. You know, what are some nitty gritty stuff that we should be doing? Raising animals is good. It's not manufacturing specific, but it is patience building, character building, and it's going to teach a lot of problem solving.
I think there is a much easier path now, because you can get a lot of desktop digital devices.
Yeah.
And that creates or facilitates creativity. You can think of something and design something and press go. But I think repairing things is something that is less doable, but also very valuable. You need equipment and you need time.
The nice thing about repairing things is the goal is a lot more definable than inventing stuff from scratch. I think that makes it accessible. Inventing stuff is very daunting because, you know, what are you inventing? Anything. What does it do? Is the feature list endless? Could be, can be.
Yes. The task is more obvious when you're trying to repair something or restore something. It may not be even repairing something outright, but to restore something from an older state to a newer state, or to upgrade a machine or a
That reminds me of some conversations that we had more than 10 years ago where you were restoring things, and it was your problem solving process was building the tools to make a thing that was made in the past so that you could restore stuff. Like, that was a very interesting combination of machinery, logistics, and artistry all together. So I remember those conversations being really stimulating for me, thinking through like bringing modern technology to old artistry, and the finished result was a tangible, knowable, pursuable goal.
Right.
So restoring stuff, I think, is also a really solid one.
Yes, and it's very good when you're trying to bootstrap a business as well. That's what drove me 25 years ago to do a lot of the things that I was trying to do, partly because I didn't want to go into it, you know, a lot of debt. And so taking someone else's equipment, which was really long in the tooth, and pull it all down, a lot of it was often analog, and then to make it digital and to revamp it.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's extremely educational. Yeah. So is that, so now we've talked about the grand sweep of global culture and historical trends. We talked about how we're going to instruct our own children to get involved in some of these projects. What do you think the future is going to look like? What do you think we need to be learning just to be prepared for what happens? What happens next? What are some of the things that people could be excited by and working on now?
I think a really exciting trend would be to get back into tangible trade-related activities, because when everyone says, "Oh, the future is in IT," or "the future is digital," "the future is
virtual AI stuff, magical invisible code,"
it's a lot like media went through. When radio came along, that upset the newspapers, and when television came along, that upset radio, and then when the internet came along, that upset all of them. And
disruption is always exciting, fascinating, fun, but
and it does have a very big impact. And if you're either in very, very early and make a big splash, that might be good for you. Or if you come in at a point where a lot of the high R&D development cost has dropped off, but you're not too late to the party, those trendy industries, say like additive printing, would be perhaps one of those that's really taken off recently. And it's tempting to then just go all out additive, but then everyone does. So then a big void gets left behind in other systems. So without sounding too old school, I think it's important not to lose what has been the backbone of industry, maybe for a previous generation or two.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, a lot of that stuff, you can't get away from it. It's just too important. Making stuff out of metal, machining stuff out of metal, knowing how to run a lathe, that's never actually going away. And the principles of running a manual lathe and writing G code for an automated lathe, or running a CAM program for a fancy CNC lathe, like there's a lot of overlap.
Yes. Yes.
Well, the good news is that additive manufacturing is very cool. It's very disruptive. Everybody's doing it, but so many people are doing it. It's so trendy that it's actually kind of boring again. So in some ways, I almost feel a pendulum swinging back to where making stuff by hand, making stuff the old-fashioned way, artisanal crafts are cool again in certain circles. And I think that young people might be really interested in knowing the old ways that stuff used to be made, and appreciate some of the skill and handcrafting capability that people had when they did stuff the old-fashioned way. So is that an inspirational, I don't know the right term for it, but is that something that catches people's attention and gets them plugged in some ways?
I think so, because a lot of those old systems have been probably misrepresented by the new technology. The new technology gives you the opportunity to do things that you can't do the old way, but doesn't necessarily mean the old way is irrelevant.
Right. Like the Bridgeport behind us cannot do some of the things that the Haas machine behind me can do.
Right.
But the Bridgeport can do the old stuff better than the Haas machine can do the old stuff.
It's very
so much faster for a lot of setups.
Flexible for smaller jobs and things like that, which would be it's the difference between a small task being worth doing or not. If you've got a project referenced in a CNC machine and tooled up for that, to do a 10-minute job is just not going to happen if it involves pulling a machine down for an hour and
resetting the vise, finding new tools, inputting them all. Yeah.
Yes. So one line of work that has fascinated me back in Australia was two brothers who ran a sand casting foundry. They made gearboxes for racing cars.
I was going to say sand casting is not a new technology.
It is not a new technology. It's about as old as it gets, I think, really.
Yeah.
And they had a really strong business, very versatile. They had government contracts and they had defence contracts, and they're making memorial plaques for, buildings and.
And you mentioned gearboxes. These are gearboxes for vehicles?
For military vehicles and the racing industry.
Okay, so it's important stuff, fun stuff, creative stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
and some of the more creative side of things was very ornamental lace work for heritage buildings. So it was about as far an extreme from a racing gearbox.
Yeah.
It's the lace work on a Victorian home.
There's a variety is always fun when you have a craft that you're pursuing. Yeah.
Or big ornamental lampposts and things that you see as in historic restoration work or reproduction work. That technology is not new technology. It's very, very skillful. It involves some heavy equipment, like some of their furnaces and things are not DIY equipment.
Sure. Yes, I can see that. Yeah. You've done some DIY aluminum casting, if I recall, but on a slightly smaller scale.
Not on their scale, yes.
You can do aluminum casting on the kitchen stove, right? Just a bit.
Best when your mother's not around. Yeah.
Well, since she may listen to this podcast, we'll skip lightly over the story and go back to
lightly over the damage that occurred in the kitchen when the sand mold was not adequately dry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is this the kind of inspirational stuff that, perhaps children shouldn't do unsupervised aluminum casting in the middle of the kitchen? But is this the kind of stuff? Is this the kind of project that dads can do with kids, maybe safely outdoors, that gets them on the right track of thinking through this stuff?
It's actually ironic that the supply chains that we mentioned before will deliver you small-scale kits for these type of activities very, very easily.
All right. Well, that's a recommendation. Christmas is coming up. That sounds like a fantastic Christmas gift if I ever heard one. Yeah.
Quite. So the supply chain that logistics and things that makes it so easy to not be bothered to make something or do something for yourself, just buy it online. Also, is the same supply chain that can facilitate exploring all sorts of new worlds, like small scale sand casting and pattern making, mold making, milling, pressing. You can buy little desktop hydraulic presses and things like that, which promote and enable you to create things that you probably could buy and probably might even be cheaper to buy.
Yeah.
But you lose something when you defer to the skills and abilities of other people.
Right. Especially if one of your goals is to learn a skill or to teach a skill to your children. One of the most useful things that I think in my own childhood, so it wasn't manufacturing related, but the fact that my dad was doing video production and cameras kept coming out that were new and animation equipment and computers, editing stopped being on tape and started being on disc. Watching my dad have to learn new stuff from scratch every couple of years was really good because it taught me that you can learn new stuff from scratch and that you will just be expected to do that in the future.
And going from a 2 megapixel camera for $2,000 to a 4 megapixel camera for $4,000.
I got 4 cameras on my phone. It's amazing. They all outclass the cameras that we had when I was a kid that were $30,000 and weighed 80 pounds. And so watching my dad have to learn new stuff and not grumble about it, but just say, this is normal to learn stuff, to build skills, I think was really helpful. Now, I do wish that we'd done a little bit more manufacturing and making stuff. We remodeled a couple of houses. Like we did some hands-on things, but the more that we've done stuff here at T.REX, the more I really want to make sure that I give my kids a window into this world not that they end up here, not that they end up stuck in manufacturing or they stay in manufacturing or they become engineers, but just that they have an understanding of it, the basics, the foundations. They'll have more data to make their own decisions in the future, more shelves in their brain to learn new stuff. And if they watch me learn stuff from scratch, and that's okay, and hopefully they learn that it's doable. I'm trying to actually learn stuff.
Right.
I think that's going to be really helpful too.
It doesn't have to be a particular trajectory that you're putting them on. It doesn't have to be a chore. It doesn't have to be a I want to do this with you, or it's necessary to have a desire to learn, an enthusiasm to learn, and it's not necessarily academic.
Yeah. I'm really excited about these opportunities. I'm glad you pointed out that we were kind of complaining about the lack of intermediate tool stores in physical space. But the fact that with some of the internationalization, faster supply chains, all of those have a negative effect here, but they have a positive effect other places. It is so easy to buy stuff from McMaster-Carr and build stuff at home. That's really exciting. There's so many powerful tools. Like the old ways are important. The fundamentals are valuable. Cutting stuff on an ancient lathe is cool in ways that computer controlled equipment can't be. But the fact that you can buy desktop CNC machines now and they're quite affordable. The fact that you can buy 3D printing machines for a few $100s and just start experimenting with CAD and just start experimenting with stuff is very cool. But people need to just kind of lean into it. Like
They do need to lean into it.
Don't just do it as a hobby, but figure it out.
As a society, whether it's Australia or America, we really do live in a bit of a paradox, because more than ever, you can buy and access resources for creativity and innovation more than ever in history. And you can also just buy the thing pre-made for $9.95 in a plastic bag, probably from Asia. So then what's the difference between the two? The difference is our mindset and whether we just want to click and add to cart, or whether we want to click and add to cart, then go and utilize and develop what it is that we put in that cart, So you could 3D print something, or you could just buy the thing finished. Which way do we go?
Yeah.
And that comes down to us as parents, as to manufacturers, as to doers of things. And so developing the vision and the activities, it's often not entirely a money thing, Yes, you could buy something for $9.95 and not have to learn how to make that part, or how to avoid bubbles in that material.
Right.
Or to be disappointed with the way it didn't really adhere correctly, or whatever.
These are all valuable lessons that sound like they happened fairly recently during a project that won't be named. Yeah.
But then you gain that financial benefit by having the instant result. And then you have to go and spend time and money elsewhere educating yourself through some other means.
Right. Yeah.
And you end up spending the same amount of energy getting to the same place.
Yeah. So one of the things that I see people talking about on the internet is they point out two problems. One problem is that our academic institutions are not teaching practical, tangible skills at the highest level that they used to, and the stuff is less useful and applicable and not taught as well, and so standards are lower and scores are lower and everything's just worse. And then on the other hand, our academic institutions are in trouble because there's so much good information elsewhere. I don't see these as two problems. I see these as things that this is like a self-solving problem. Like this is this is not two similar problems. This is a problem and a solution together. the opportunities that exist to learn stuff today are pretty incredible. So I want to make sure that we're taking advantage of those things, because that is pretty significant. Are you sending your kids to university? Is that something that you are planning for?
Which university?
Well, I was going to say the University of Hard Knocks, real world experience, etc.
That's the one I'm thinking
The
of.
good one. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, a bit of a trick question. But yeah, the opportunities to save a lot of money and time. I mean, I think back to in my dad's day, going to film school actually was valuable because buying the equipment to do it yourself was not really an option. Well, around the time that I was a little kid, buying the equipment was totally an option, but it was kind of 50-50. Like spending a lot of time in film school buying $30,000 cameras, like this is a hard trade-off. This is a gamble. Well, now it's not a gamble at all. Going to film school to get your hands on the equipment is completely unnecessary. The equipment is readily available, free. I'm sure that there's super high-end engineering labs and things in universities that are absolutely worth going to do, but you can also just get all kinds of tools and equipment and capabilities for less than a year's tuition or a semester and just get your hands dirty and just do the thing. And there's YouTube videos galore explaining how to get started. And so, yeah, we live in a fascinating time, and I hope that we just develop the right mindset to take proper advantage of it, because it's pretty exciting.
It is very exciting. YouTube and the number of people who just, offer, their time and thoughts, demonstrating what sometimes is very menial or necessary tasks, replacing a brake rotor on a vehicle, on a specific model and type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is very valuable. I was mentioning the other day, the prized possession of a lot of people's living rooms used to be a big Britannica encyclopedia set.
Yeah.
And they were so expensive. It became a major, or at the time was a major status situation, because it was very hard to afford.
Yeah.
And our phones coupled, or the YouTube smartphone combination now has just completely left that kind of information in the dust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To our benefit,
Right. If we have discernment and we actually use it and we actually use it well.
And we have the energy and we have the vision.
Right.
To sort of say, okay, because I can figure out how to repair it myself, it's actually very doable to find, the details to repair some things, 30 years ago was quite a hassle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now it's not. So we've got all the reason to be excited about 2025 and the next 10 years and the next 10 years after that, and teaching our children what they can do, because the obstacles are gone from a knowledge base.
Yeah.
Information is readily available while YouTube's up, while, the internet is available to us to give, or to give them the information or to download. So,
yeah, I mean, like I said before, I am excited. Occasionally I look around and I'm less excited because I see, a trend here, or I've talked to somebody who's very depressed about the future there, and it kind of rubs off on me. But going to the Design to Part show, talking to people about what they're seeing in the industry, seeing some of the tools that are available, was super encouraging. There's some specific projects that I saw something that I didn't know existed, and I was like, oh, that thing that we want to make that we don't know how to make, I think we might know how to make it now. Like, that is one of the most gratifying things.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I think going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, some of the contrasts, one of the things I see here is you can go through a whole professional career path in a very specialized manner. So like my colleague here, has spent a lot of his time working in an office with 300 other engineers
Right.
under the one roof, in the one office, in a big complex, and they all take one tiny little slice of this very large undertaking that might take months or years to develop.
Right. Yeah.
And so those skills are really valuable, but then how do you function outside of that really large scale dynamic? And a really exciting opportunity is that what if you can learn the skills that are utilized in those big organizations and apply them in a smaller scale?
Right. Yeah.
So I'm really excited about learning more of his geometry and
Yeah. Some of the specialties.
tolerances and
Yeah. I do think we rely a little too much on specialties and credentials, but they offer a tremendous amount of value. If you have been able to spend that level of focus time on a specific discipline, you are truly a specialist. You have some real stuff to bring to the table at that point. So it is interesting. Yeah. Neither of us are specialists, really, I've noticed.
you are in front of the camera.
I spent a fair amount of time in front of the camera recently. I suppose that we sort of mentioned before we mentioned that you're from Australia. Just talk a little bit about how we got to know each other. We should probably at least tell the folks that as we kind of wrap things up, because it feels like that's where we've sort of ended up. Here in the States, there is a tendency more towards more specialization. Inside some of the bigger, more centralized businesses, firms, institutions, companies, I would like to make sure that my kids have an understanding of that, but also are a little bit more multi-tool capable, multi-faceted perhaps, partly because I don't know what the future holds. I couldn't pick a good specialty for them to pursue at this point that I would recommend in good conscience with what the future looks like. When I met you, you already had done, and this was some time ago, by the way, you had already done so many different things that it was really, really impressive to me. So, yeah, what do we want to tell people? You are from Australia, as your accent indicates. I lived in New Zealand for some time, and so where did we meet? The Southern Hemisphere. That's how we got together.
So funny, I only have to say one word or two words and people pick the accent, and often pick it's an Australian accent within 2, maybe 3 words.
I'm actually impressed that Americans can do that. I'm terrible at it. I had an Uber driver who was from Australia and had been born in New Zealand, and it took me a long time to figure out his accent. I lived in New Zealand long enough that it's almost transparent to me. And then my kids were listening to Ken Ham talk, and some other children, their cousins, were right next to them and being like, "We don't understand what this man is saying." And my kids were like, "Yeah, no, we can understand them. They've been hanging out with your kids. They understand the New Zealand accent just fine, the Australian accent just fine."
Yes.
Now you almost came to Tennessee a long time ago because you had a job opportunity, which fell through. Ultimately, but you almost came to Tennessee to do one of the most Tennessee things, quintessentially Tennessee things, stereotypically Tennessee things ever, which was, what was it again? An art piece, a traveling art piece, a billboard?
At the time, I was doing a lot of carved work for, including signage and murals, that sort of thing. And a rather large liquor producer here in
You don't want to mention the name, but a distillery.
A very well-known distillery.
Prominent, well-known, Tennessee-based distillery. Yeah.
Yes.
Now this is a whole other topic. We should get Ryan to talk about this because he works with ad agencies, but the distillery didn't contact you. A whole collection of like ad agencies, media companies, and other people who eventually contacted you.
Right. It was a big media company. I think it would have been 2009. It would have been. They said, "Can you carve this whopping great mural They're talking like in feet over here, meters.
Yeah.
10 or 12 meters long, whatever that is in feet.
It's pretty long, yeah. Well, and of course you could have done it because you are in addition to an automation engineer now and a bunch of other things, you are a phenomenal wood carver. So you totally could have pulled off this project.
This was doable, and their proposal was to do this enormous, great big thing that was also quite tall, in very thick panels. And their first proposal, by memory, was to stand it upright in a permanent position in the centre of Melbourne.
Well, that makes perfect sense for a Tennessee distillery, I suppose.
I didn't quite know why they were wanting to do that. And then
these advertising agencies, I'm telling you.
I sort of said, what's the budget? Is this realistically going to happen? This is a lot of work. It's a very expensive process, you know. They go, oh, no, this is for real. This is a big opportunity. And then the idea morphed into having this great big sign, a mural, travel around.
Massive hand-carved
and it was
wooden.
bigger than an 18-wheel trailer, so I don't know how it was going to fit on the 18-wheeler.
Right, yeah.
And then the idea morphed further into actually travelling to a port, and then the film footage actually showing this big sign, which included a thank you message to this particular
Distillery.
Yeah. And then travelling to the distillery across the Australian countryside and then across the American countryside.
It sounds like a great video. Yeah.
And then at some point, I pointed out that if the sign was going to go in the container, the shipping container, it would have to be a little smaller, which they weren't too keen about. And they also wanted it to stay on the truck when it went in the container. So
that is better looking for the camera. So what's the problem?
Well, yes. At the point when the truck and this very large mural had to both go in the container, I kind of got concerned that the truck wouldn't fit in the container, and I let the whole idea go.
Yeah. That was, again, ad agency folks, media people.
That was the first realistic or first thoughts of coming to Tennessee occurred.
Yeah. Well, in a way, I'm disappointed that didn't work out, but also it was literally impossible at that point. And they had a ridiculous time frame for you doing this insane amount of hand carving for this huge, almost immovable object that was then going to have this huge traveling tour. So almost every aspect of this project was physically stretching the bounds of reality.
The scope of the first work was somewhere in the vicinity of 500 to 1,000 hours.
Yeah, well, that's a couple of weeks' work, isn't it? Yeah.
And then it ended up being the schedule coming down to, under 100 hours. So,
oh yeah, you can just pare that right down.
That was going to happen.
Yeah. So it was obvious that wasn't going to happen, but it would have got you to Tennessee a little bit sooner. So
yes,
you ended up here eventually.
Yes, it was a very interesting venture to explore.
So I really appreciated my time in New Zealand, getting to see another culture. I mean, New Zealand's it wasn't like it's drastically different from the States. There's no language barrier. Some interesting food items. But other than that, it's not drastically different culturally speaking. But having the perspective of living in another place and then having these perspective coming back to the States and seeing America with, I think, clearer eyes is something I value quite a bit. And now you have that, seeing America with fresh eyes. Your kids have that. But I'm really grateful for those opportunities, and I think that that those have made me better at bit better perspective on certain things. But they certainly have made me less of a specialist overall and more of a multifaceted sounds a little too complimentary. I'm more of a multi-tool, a master of fewer skills than I've taken on. Is that something that you want to inculcate in your children?
I do, actually.
That
I do.
faceted.
It may be contrary to, in some ways, the American way of doing things, but I think it's also a really big strength to specialize very strongly in limited thought patterns and activities. Is a nice idea in some ways, but I think it can be limiting.
Yeah. Some people need to do it, but I think it stagnates a society when everybody is told to be a specialist. A specialist is the highest ideal for everybody is, I think, the wrong message.
And to some extent, we all have to do it. Here at T.REX, we make holsters. We don't make automobiles.
Right.
So
and as the company's gotten bigger, certain people specialize more than back when we used to wear all the hats. Yeah.
Right. And we all have specific roles in the business, and so everyone has to choose what they're predominantly going to do in a career path and, on a day-to-day basis. But to how far you take that, can be detrimental.
Yeah. So my goal is to equip my kids for a whole bunch of stuff, which dovetails nicely with T.REX's mission. Equipping serious citizens, inspiring, educating, equipping.
Well, the inspiring does too, because that's sort of the main thrust of what I keep seeing is utilizing what we have available to us online and via logistics. That's very prominent here in America, is to use that as inspiration, not as complacency.
Right. It's pretty easy to do stuff here. It's very easy to complain about how they're not as good as they used to be, or they're not as good as they were in Australia, or they're not as good as they used to be in New Zealand. But instead to use them as opportunities.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the other reason I want my kids to have multiple skills and to expect to change direction a few times and continue to learn new things is, I think there is a lot of change coming. You mentioned technologies disrupting things in the past. I think that's going to happen in the future. I think AI is going to do that a bit. I think some of these new manufacturing technologies are going to do this a bit. I think that the old skills are going to continue to have value. And I want my children to be able to move within these different areas, not get stuck in one spot, be able to go where they're needed and do the stuff that needs doing. I mean, that's really the main thing.
Right. Discernment, enthusiasm. It's easy to be focused on what you're good at the expense of understanding what you should be good at.
Oh, I like that. That's nice. Yeah.
It's sometimes it can be a real roadblock to sort of say, this is what I'm good at. This is what I want to sell. This is what I want to do. This is the opportunity I need to have because this is where I've placed my investment. But to have more than one skill or to have numerous skills, even if they're not quite as developed, to be able to pivot and to turn.
To have the flexibility to say, this is what is needed now.
Yes, and have the willingness to not be afraid of saying, you know what, I'm in the wrong career path. Or I'm in the right career path, but I'm not able to implement it here. I'm going to use this career path to do a different line of work.
Or I'm going to move to the other side of the world.
Well, that's right.
Could happen. It's possible. Yeah.
Yep. To be very committed to one skill set is
limiting. Yeah.
And it can also bring a certain amount of apprehension.
Well, I appreciate your insight and your thoughts on this. Like I said, your kids are further ahead than mine. You've given them a lot more care and thought in this area, and I think that you are a tremendous example of that. So I want to just continue to watch what you're doing and get your ideas. And I also want to thank you for coming to work at T.REX, going to the Design to Part show with me, and being on the podcast. because I know that you'd much rather be behind the cameras than in front of them, and I appreciate you having this conversation.
Well, I'd like to thank T.REX for being willing to have such a technological radical.
Technological radical from Mad Max land. Yeah.